Hey there, viewers. Do you believe people eventually face the consequences of their actions no matter how powerful they are? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's dive into this jaw-dropping tale of Diddy's most desperate moment in prison. Chapter 1. Life Behind Bars. The air inside Brooklyn's Metropolitan Detention Center was heavy, a mix of sweat, sterilized metal, and a strange, unspoken tension that clung to the walls. It was a far cry from the luxurious world Sean Diddy Combs once ruled, a place where champagne flowed like water and private jets whisked him from one corner of the world to another. Here, the only thing that flowed was time, slow and unforgiving, marked by the harsh buzz of electric doors and the monotonous shuffle of inmates moving through corridors. I'd been granted limited access to the prison, part of a broader piece I was working on about high-profile inmates. It wasn't the kind of assignment I usually sought out, but something about Diddy's fall from grace intrigued me. He wasn't just another celebrity, he was a symbol of success, indulgence, and excess. Now he was a man stripped of all that, confined to a cell like everyone else, his designer suits replaced by a baggy orange jumpsuit that hung awkwardly on his once pristine frame. Seeing him for the first time was jarring. His trademark swagger, the air of untouchable confidence, was gone. His posture was slouched, his shoulders weighed down by more than just the jumpsuit. His face, usually framed by a meticulously groomed beard, now bore patches of gray stubble, and his eyes were bloodshot and hollow. The man who once commanded rooms full of celebrities now sat alone at a cafeteria table, poking at a plate of unidentifiable slop with a plastic fork. Rumors about him rippled through the prison, carried by whispers between guards and inmates alike. At first, the stories were about his arrogance, how he'd strutted into the facility expecting special treatment. Word was he'd tried to throw his weight around, name-dropping powerful friends and threatening to make calls that would remind everyone who he was. But prison isn't impressed by fame, and it wasn't long before reality set in. Denied bail not once but 3 times, Diddy quickly learned that his connections and wealth held no sway here. The initial bravado reportedly gave way to frustration, then desperation. Inmates whispered about the night he'd slammed his fists against the metal door of his cell, shouting for hours until his voice gave out. Others claimed they'd seen him pacing his cell like a caged animal, muttering to himself about getting out and making it right. The cafeteria was where I got my first real glimpse of his day-to-day existence. He wasn't sitting with anyone. His reputation made sure of that. Most inmates kept their distance, whether out of respect, intimidation, or a simple unwillingness to associate with a man whose name was now tied to over 100 allegations of sexual misconduct and trafficking. The guards, too, kept an eye on him, though I couldn't tell if it was out of concern or suspicion. One of them, a grizzled man named Reed, had worked at the facility for over 2 decades. He told me Diddy was holding up better than most, but there was a note of doubt in his voice. "He's quiet," Reed said, leaning against the cafeteria door frame. "Keeps to himself mostly, but you can see it in his eyes. He's unraveling." Unraveling seemed like the right word. Over the weeks I spent at the facility, I started to notice it more and more. Diddy had a habit of glancing over his shoulder as if expecting someone or something to be there. He flinched at sudden noises, and his hands, once steady as they signed multi-million-dollar contracts, now trembled as he carried his tray back to his cell. There was a palpable sense of paranoia about him, like he was carrying the weight of all the secrets he'd spent a lifetime trying to bury. The guards weren't the only ones who noticed. Inmates whispered about it during recreation time, huddled in groups as they watched Diddy pace the perimeter of the yard. "Man's losing it," one of them said, shaking his head. "He thought he was untouchable, and now look at him, just another number." One story in particular stuck with me. An inmate who worked in the laundry room claimed he'd seen Diddy crouched in the corner of his cell one night, whispering to himself. "It's like he was talking to someone who wasn't there," the inmate said, his voice low and conspiratorial. kept saying, "They're coming for me. They're coming." Diddy's repeated bail denials only seemed to exacerbate his decline. Each rejection was a hammer blow, shattering whatever hope he'd managed to cling to. The news of his third denial hit him particularly hard. According to another inmate, Diddy had spent hours sitting on his bunk afterward, staring at the wall, unmoving. It was as if the reality of his situation had finally sunk in. He wasn't getting out anytime soon, and no amount of money or influence could change that. Yet, for all his struggles, there were moments when the old Diddy seemed to resurface. During one of the facility's holiday events, he joined a card game with a group of inmates, flashing a brief, almost defiant smile as he won a round. "Man still got that charm," one of the players admitted later, though he quickly added, "But you can tell it's just for show." And then there was the meditation. It was something he'd picked up during his first month in jail, a way to cope with the stress and anxiety that threatened to consume him. I'd seen him sitting cross-legged in his cell, eyes closed, breathing deeply in a rhythm that seemed almost mechanical. It was a stark contrast to the chaos that surrounded him. But even that, I suspected, was a mask. Another attempt to hold himself together as the walls closed in. The whispers about his paranoia continued to grow, fueled by his increasingly erratic behavior. Some inmates claimed they'd heard him talking in his sleep, muttering about names and places that meant nothing to them but carried an undeniable weight. Others said he'd started keeping a small notebook. Whatever was going on inside his head, one thing was clear. Diddy was a man on the edge, teetering between denial and despair. And as I watched him shuffle back to his cell that day, his shoulders hunched and his head bowed, I couldn't help but wonder what demons he was trying so desperately to outrun, and how much longer he could keep them at bay. Chapter 2. A Nightmare Holiday. Christmas in Brooklyn's Metropolitan Detention Center wasn't Christmas at all. The air carried none of the warmth or cheer found beyond these walls, only the sterile chill of confinement. Outside, the city buzzed with holiday lights, carols, and the excitement of last-minute shopping. But inside, the atmosphere was heavier than ever. For inmates like Sean Diddy Combs, the holiday season wasn't a time for joy. It was a cruel reminder of everything they'd lost. In the days leading up to Christmas, Diddy's demeanor grew more restless, more agitated. He paced his cell for hours, muttering under his breath. Word spread quickly among the inmates that he'd been counting on his legal team to get him out in time to spend Christmas with his family. The denial of his third bail request had shattered that hope, and the realization that he'd be stuck here for the holidays seemed to unmoor him completely. I'd seen him earlier that morning, seated alone in the cafeteria. His usual stoic silence was replaced by a visible tension, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. It was clear he was unraveling, and it wasn't long before the cracks became fractures. The breaking point came that afternoon. Diddy, normally reserved and controlled in his interactions, snapped. He banged on his cell door, yelling for the guards. "I need help!" His voice echoed through the block, raw and desperate. "I can't take this anymore. You have to take me to the hospital." The guards arrived quickly, their expressions a mix of irritation and concern. One of them, a burly man with a no-nonsense demeanor, barked for Diddy to back away from the door. But Diddy didn't listen. He was shaking, his hands gripping the bars as if trying to pull them apart. His voice broke as he pleaded, "Please, I think something's wrong with me. I need to see a doctor." It was a moment that seemed to freeze the block. Inmates stopped their conversations, their card games, their pacing. All eyes turned to the man who had once been a symbol of untouchable power, now reduced to begging for relief. The tension in the air was palpable, a mixture of disbelief, pity, and a touch of schadenfreude. "Man, look at him," one inmate muttered, shaking his head. "All that money, all that fame, and he's still just like the rest of us." Not everyone was so dismissive. A few inmates exchanged concerned glances, murmuring about how the holidays messed with people's heads in here. Even those who didn't care for Diddy's celebrity status seemed to recognize that this wasn't just another outburst. It was the unraveling of a man who had built his life on control, now powerless in the face of confinement. The guards eventually managed to calm him down, though not without difficulty. They escorted him to the infirmary for a brief evaluation, but denied his request to be transferred to a hospital. "There's nothing wrong with you that a little time won't fix," one of them reportedly told him, the words cutting like a blade. When he returned to his cell, he was visibly shaken. He sat on the edge of his bunk, his head in his hands, his body heaving with silent sobs. It was a stark contrast to the man who had once commanded entire rooms with a glance, now reduced to a figure of despair and vulnerability. Some of the inmates couldn't resist mocking him. "Yo, Diddy," one called out from across the block. "You gonna cry your way out of here?" Laughter followed, but it was half-hearted, lacking the usual cruelty of prison taunts. Even those who jeered seemed uncomfortable, as if witnessing his breakdown was too raw, too human to fully mock. Others, however, felt a twinge of sympathy. "Man's just trying to keep it together," one inmate said quietly, shaking his head. "Holidays mess with everybody, but I guess it hits different when you're used to having it all." Diddy's reputation within the block shifted in subtle ways after that day. He was no longer the untouchable celebrity, the larger-than-life figure. He was just another inmate, struggling to navigate the harsh reality of life behind bars. His meltdown became a topic of hushed conversation. Later that evening, I caught sight of him in his cell. The door was ajar and he was seated cross-legged on the floor, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and deliberate. It was the same meditation technique I'd seen him use before, a method he'd adopted to cope with the relentless stress of incarceration. But this time, it seemed different. There was a desperation to his practice, as if he was clinging to it like a lifeline. It took hours, but eventually he seemed to regain some semblance of composure. By the time lights out was called, he was sitting upright on his bunk, staring into the middle distance with a look of quiet determination. The cracks were still there, but he'd managed to patch them, if only temporarily. As I walked back to the visitors area, the weight of the day hung heavily on me. Seeing someone like Diddy brought so low was a sobering reminder of how unforgiving life in prison could be. The holidays, meant to be a time of warmth and connection, had become a stark contrast to the cold isolation of his cell. And yet, there was something about his resilience, however fragile, that stuck with me. But even as I tried to shake the image of him pleading with the guards, a nagging thought lingered in the back of my mind. This was more than just a holiday meltdown. The whispers about his growing paranoia, his erratic behavior, it all pointed to something deeper, something darker. And though he had managed to pull himself together for now, it was clear that this wasn't the end of his struggle. If anything, it was only the beginning. But still, who was going to explain this? And Chapter 3, The tension in the Metropolitan Detention Center was thicker than usual that morning. The air felt heavy, even oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. It wasn't unusual for the facility to have its moments of quiet, moments when the hum of conversation and the clang of metal seemed to pause. But this was different. This was a silence that gnawed at the edges of normalcy, and it didn't take long for everyone to understand why. During the early morning rounds, a veteran guard named Mason was the first to notice something wasn't right. He walked his usual path, his flashlight cutting through the dim corridor, the faint beam bouncing off the iron bars of each cell. The routine was mundane, checking on inmates who were mostly still asleep or groggily stirring. But when he reached Diddy's cell, something froze him mid-step. The faint light illuminated a figure slumped on the floor. Mason frowned, stepping closer, his flashlight steady on the scene. Diddy was motionless, his head tilted awkwardly against the metal frame of his bunk. A sock, of all things, was loosely tied around his neck, its makeshift knot suggesting something between desperation and hesitation. "Mason, code blue." Mason's voice broke the stillness, echoing down the corridor like an alarm. "I need medical in Block C, now." The next few moments blurred into chaos. Guards swarmed the block, their radios crackling with urgent chatter. Some of the inmates stirred, peering out from their cells with curiosity and unease. Whispers started almost immediately, speculation rippling like wildfire. Mason crouched by Diddy's side, his gloved fingers pressing against the rapper's neck to check for a pulse. Relief flickered across his face as he felt a faint but steady rhythm. "Still breathing," he muttered, his voice tight with urgency. "Get the medics here now." Within minutes, the medical team arrived, their hurried steps echoing off the concrete floors. They worked quickly, cutting away the sock and checking Diddy's vitals. An oxygen mask was secured over his face, and a stretcher was brought in. The once untouchable mogul, now pale and lifeless, was strapped in and wheeled out under the watchful eyes of guards and inmates alike. The sight was jarring, even for those used to the harsh realities of prison life. Diddy's larger-than-life persona had always cast a long shadow, even here. Seeing him so vulnerable, so human, left an unsettling impression on everyone who witnessed it. The prison erupted into whispers and speculation as soon as the stretcher disappeared from sight. "Man, he did that to himself," one inmate muttered to another, his tone laced with disbelief. "Looks like it," his companion replied, shaking his head. "Guess all that fame don't mean anything when you're in here." "Or maybe someone got to him," a third voice chimed in, eyes narrowing. "You know how it is. People don't want him talking." The theories multiplied by the minute. Some were convinced it was a genuine suicide attempt, the result of a man crumbling under the weight of his circumstances. Others suspected it was a desperate ploy for attention, a calculated move to get out of his cell and into a hospital bed. And then there were those who believed something darker was at play, an attempt by unseen forces to silence Diddy before he could say too much. Among the staff, the mood was no less divided. In the break room, guards exchanged wary glances and hushed words, the tension palpable. "You think he did it on purpose?" one asked, sipping his coffee as he leaned against the counter. "Could be," another replied, his brow furrowed. "Guy's been losing it for weeks. Holidays in here don't do anyone any favors." "Or maybe it's staged," Mason interjected, his voice low but firm. "Wouldn't be the first time someone pulled a stunt to get privileges. He's got a reputation to maintain, even in here." "Oh, why a sock?" someone else asked, their tone incredulous. "If he really wanted to do it, why not go all the way?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. It was a detail that didn't sit right with anyone. The sock was too flimsy, too half-hearted to suggest a genuine attempt. Yet the scene hadn't felt entirely staged either. There was an edge of desperation, a fragility that was hard to fake. As the morning wore on, news of the incident spread beyond the prison walls. Reporters gathered outside, their cameras trained on the facility as they speculated about what had happened. Inside, the inmates were left to stew in their own theories, the tension in the air growing thicker with every passing hour. When word finally came down that Diddy had been stabilized and was being held under observation at a nearby hospital, the reactions were mixed. Some shrugged it off, uninterested in the drama of a man they couldn't relate to. Others saw it as a moment of vindication, proof that even the mighty could fall. And then there were those who watched silently, their eyes reflecting a mixture of curiosity and unease. For me, the incident was a stark reminder of just how fragile the balance of power and perception could be. Diddy's fall from grace wasn't just a headline or a cautionary tale. It was a living, breathing reality, playing out in real time. And as I walked back to my office that day, the image of him being wheeled out of his cell stayed with me, a haunting echo of the man he used to be. But even as the day ended and the prison settled back into its uneasy rhythm, one question refused to leave my mind. Was this the cry of a broken man, or the warning shot of something much larger? The answer, I feared, would come sooner than any of us were prepared for. Chapter 4. The Conspiracy Theories. The prison buzzed with the kind of electricity you could feel in the air, sharp and heavy, like the moments before a storm. Diddy's hospital transfer had left a void, a space for speculation to fester and spread. By the next morning, theories swirled through every hallway and rec room like wildfire, fueled by whispers and half-truths. Some of the inmates claimed they'd seen it all coming. "And I told you he wasn't safe in here," a grizzled older inmate muttered over a game of dominoes in the common area. "Too many people got beef with him, too many secrets." His companion nodded, keeping his voice low. "You think it was one of us? Or maybe someone higher up?" That's how the theories started. At first, it was just the usual prison gossip, stories twisted and inflated by people with nothing but time on their hands. But as the hours passed, the whispers began to take shape, growing more specific and more sinister. The most persistent rumor was that someone had been paid to silence Diddy. Maybe it was a rival, someone who saw his incarceration as an opportunity to settle old scores. Or maybe it was bigger than that. An order from the outside meant to protect the names and reputations of powerful individuals who had everything to lose if Diddy started talking. "The Diddy list," one inmate whispered, his eyes darting nervously as he spoke the words. "List?" someone else asked, leaning in. "You don't know? Supposedly he's got dirt on everyone who ever stepped foot in his mansion. Celebrities, politicians, you name it. If that list exists, there's people out there who'd do anything to keep it quiet." The idea was as intoxicating as it was terrifying, a secret ledger filled with names and secrets powerful enough to ruin lives and reputations. To some, it sounded like a fantasy, a tall tale born out of boredom and conspiracy-loving minds. But to others, it felt entirely plausible. After all, wasn't that how the world worked? The rich and powerful protecting their own, no matter the cost? Even the guards weren't immune to the speculation. "Think he's got something on someone in here?" Mason asked his partner during a break, his voice a mix of curiosity and unease. "Maybe," the other guard replied, sipping his coffee. "But I don't think this was just about prison politics. This feels bigger." "Like what?" The guard shrugged but didn't answer. He didn't need to. The implications hung in the air like smoke, thick, suffocating, impossible to ignore. As for me, I couldn't stop thinking about the sock. It seemed too strange, too theatrical. Was it really an act of desperation, or had someone staged the scene to send a message? The fact that Diddy had survived only deepened the mystery. If this was an attempt to silence him, it had failed. But if it was meant to scare him or warn him, then it had worked perfect. Adding to the unease were the whispers about bribes. According to some of the inmates, money had been changing hands in the days leading up to the incident. Small sums slipped quietly to those willing to keep an eye on Diddy, or worse, to make his life miserable. "They think cash can fix everything," one inmate scoffed, his voice dripping with disdain. "But some things you can't buy your way out of." But what if it wasn't just cash? What if it was leverage, threats, promises, blackmail? The possibilities were endless, and each one seemed darker than the last. Then there were the rumors about Diddy himself. Some said he was cracking under the pressure, his once unshakable confidence now eroding with each passing day. Others insisted he was still pulling strings from his cell, using his connections to manipulate the system, even from behind bars. "Don't let the meditation stuff fool you," one guard warned me after a shift. "Guys like him, they don't stop scheming just because they're locked up. If anything, they get smarter about it." But what kind of scheme could explain what had happened in that cell? If Diddy was staging an incident, it wasn't just for attention, it was for survival. And if someone else was behind it, then the stakes were higher than anyone realized. The idea of a cover-up began to take root, fed by fragments of overheard conversations and the unease that hung over the entire facility. It wasn't just about Diddy's alleged crimes anymore. It was about what those crimes might reveal, and who might be implicated if the full story ever came out. And then there was the list. Whether it was real or imagined, The mere mention of it was enough to make people uneasy. If such a thing existed, it could explain everything: the fire at his mansion, the lawsuits piling up, the relentless pressure to keep him behind bars. It could also explain why someone might want to silence him for good. By the end of the day, the rumors had grown into something almost tangible, a shadow that seemed to stretch across every corner of the prison. But for all the speculation, no one had any real answers, only questions, and the sense that something much larger was at play. And as I sat at my desk that night, replaying the events of the past few days in my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was just out of reach, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 5: The Hospital Revelation. The hospital lobby buzzed with its usual mix of controlled chaos. Nurses hurrying between stations, doctors conferring in hushed tones, and the occasional burst of noise from the ER. But behind the clinical facade, there was an undercurrent of tension, as if everyone there knew something they weren't saying. I had arrived under the guise of reporting on inmate health conditions, a convenient excuse to follow up on the Diddy story. My contact, a nurse named Carla, met me near the reception desk. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a tight line. "You didn't hear this from me," she said, leading me down a hallway toward the staff break room. Once inside, she closed the door and leaned against it, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But something's off about the whole thing." She handed me a clipboard with a copy of Diddy's initial intake report. My eyes scanned the page, noting the key details: unconscious upon arrival, signs of oxygen deprivation, and faint bruising around the neck. The marks were described as inconsistent with self-inflicted injuries. My stomach tightened as I reread that line. "Inconsistent how?" I asked, glancing up at her. Carla hesitated, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might overhear. "The marks weren't in a typical pattern for strangulation, too uniform, like they were placed there." "Staged," I murmured. She nodded grimly. "And that's not the weirdest part. When he came to, he was, well, you should have heard him." "What did he say?" Carla hesitated again, clearly uncomfortable. "He kept muttering about betrayal. Something like, 'They're coming for me and I should have seen it.' Over and over." A chill ran down my spine. "Did he say who?" "No names," she said. "But he was disoriented, agitated. It took a while to calm him down." I flipped through the rest of the report, noting the list of tests they'd run. No drugs in his system, no pre-existing conditions that could explain the collapse. Just one line stood out: "Patient exhibits signs of extreme psychological distress." "Did he mention the sock?" I asked. Carla shook her head. "Not directly, but the guards who brought him in. They were acting strange too, tight-lipped, on edge, almost like they didn't want us asking questions." I leaned back against the wall, the weight of the situation settling over me. The sock incident had already sparked endless speculation in the prison, and now this. The idea that someone might have orchestrated the whole thing, or that Diddy himself had staged it, felt both absurd and disturbingly plausible. "Do you think he did this to himself?" I asked. Carla exhaled sharply. "I don't know, but if he did, it wasn't just a cry for help, it was a statement." Her words stuck with me as I left the hospital, replaying everything I'd learned. The details didn't add up. Diddy's behavior, the marks on his neck, the guard's strange demeanor. And then there were his mutterings about betrayal, as if someone close to him had turned against him. But who? And why now? Back at my desk, I sifted through my notes, trying to make sense of it all. Theories swirled in my head like smoke, each one darker than the last. Was this part of the conspiracy I'd been hearing about? A warning from someone higher up the chain? Or was it simply the unraveling of a man who had once controlled everything but now found himself powerless? One thing was certain: Diddy's desperation was growing. Even the hospital, briefly a place of refuge, had done little to ease his isolation. If anything, it had made him more vulnerable, exposing him to a world that no longer revolved around his whims. As I pieced together the fragments of the story, I couldn't help but wonder if Diddy's unraveling was inevitable. The decisions he'd made, the people he'd hurt, the secrets he'd kept, they were all catching up to him, one way or another. "What you do comes back to you," the phrase echoed in my mind, heavy with implication. For Diddy, it wasn't just a warning, it was a reckoning. And as I prepared for the next step in my investigation, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Chapter 6. The Breaking Point. The dim fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the cell block as Diddy was escorted back to his cell. The clang of the door closing behind him echoed down the hall, a sound that had become all too familiar. But this time, it carried a different weight. The incident had shifted the air inside the prison. There was a tension now, thicker, heavier, and far more dangerous. The guards were the first to show the change. Their usual indifference had given way to a sharp-edged vigilance. Diddy's every move was scrutinized, every word logged. They patrolled his cell block with a new intensity, lingering near his door as though expecting him to make another scene. Whispers spread that the warden had issued a direct order to keep an eye on Combs. Whether it was for his safety or theirs, no one could say. Diddy, for his part, retreated further into himself. His cell, once a place of reluctant routine, now felt like a trap. He paced the small space relentlessly, his footsteps a steady, maddening rhythm against the concrete. His eyes darted toward the door at every sound, every passing shadow, as if he expected someone to burst in at any moment. Among the inmates, the reactions were mixed. Some viewed the sock incident as a desperate cry for help, a sign that even the mighty could fall. These were the ones who offered quiet words of sympathy, smuggled extra food from the cafeteria, or nodded in silent solidarity as he passed. Others, however, saw it as weakness, a crack in the armor of a man who once seemed untouchable. They avoided him in the yard, their eyes lingering just long enough to convey a warning. Whatever storm was brewing around him, they wanted no part of it. For Diddy, the isolation was suffocating. He had always thrived on control over his image, his empire, the people in his orbit. But here, behind bars, that control had been stripped away. His wealth, his influence, even his charm, all useless in a place where survival depended on alliances and instinct. And then there was the paranoia. It started as a whisper in the back of his mind, a nagging doubt he couldn't quite shake. At first it was the guards, the way they lingered too long, their conversations abruptly cutting off when he approached. Then it was the inmates, their sideways glances, the hushed tones whenever he walked by. Soon it seemed as though the entire prison was conspiring against him. One night, as the cell block settled into uneasy silence, Diddy sat on the edge of his bunk, staring at the wall. His hands trembled slightly, and his breathing was shallow. "They're watching me," he muttered to himself. "Every move, every word, they want me gone." His cellmate, a wiry man named Dre, looked up from his bunk with a mix of curiosity and concern. "Who's they?" he asked cautiously. Diddy didn't answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on the wall, his jaw clenched. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and deliberate. "The ones pulling the strings. The ones who don't want the truth coming out." Dre raised an eyebrow. "What truth?" Diddy's gaze shifted to him, and for a moment there was a flicker of the man he used to be, confident, commanding, larger than life. "You think this is about me, about what I did?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "There's more to this. Things you wouldn't believe, names, places, secrets that could tear everything apart." Dre's expression turned wary. "Man, you're losing it." "Am I?" Diddy shot back, his voice sharp. "Or am I the only one who sees what's really going on?" The conversation ended there, but the words lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Diddy's mutterings about secrets and betrayal only deepened the unease that had settled over the prison. Whispers spread among the inmates, each retelling more exaggerated than the last. Some claimed he was about to spill dirt on powerful figures, while others speculated he was losing his grip on reality. The guards, too, seemed to sense the shift. Their eyes lingered on him longer, their footsteps echoing louder in the halls outside his cell. One morning, as Diddy stood in line for breakfast, a guard leaned in close, his voice barely above a growl. "Careful who you talk to, Combs. You never know who's listening." The comment rattled him more than he cared to admit. Back in his cell, he replayed the words over and over, each time feeling the walls close in a little tighter. The paranoia was consuming him, feeding on his isolation, his guilt, and the weight of the secrets he carried. In the days that followed, Diddy's behavior became increasingly erratic. He snapped at guards, muttered to himself in the yard, and refused to eat during meals. At night, his restless pacing kept his cellmate awake, the rhythmic sound echoing like a heartbeat through the silent cell block. And yet, beneath the paranoia and desperation, there was something else, a spark of defiance. Diddy began dropping cryptic hints to anyone who would listen, vague allusions to the bigger picture and the truth that would come to light. To some, it sounded like the ramblings of a broken man grasping at straws. To others, it was a warning, a sign that the story wasn't over, that the most shocking revelations were yet to come. By the time the week ended, the tension in the prison had reached a breaking point. Inmates whispered in corners, guards exchanged knowing glances, and Diddy retreated further into his own mind. Whatever was coming, it felt inevitable, like the calm before a storm. As I pieced together the details for my article, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just the downfall of a celebrity. It was a reckoning, a collision of power, guilt, and consequence. And at the center of it all was a man who had built his empire on secrets that were finally starting to unravel. Chapter 7: The Message of Karma. The air in the detention center always seemed heavier at night, as if the weight of the building's stories pressed down harder when the sun disappeared. The fluorescent hum of the lights and the muffled voices of guards exchanging shifts were the only sounds, a stark contrast to the high-energy world Sean Diddy Combs had once commanded. From the outside looking in, his fall seemed almost scripted, a tale too poetic to be coincidence. It was impossible not to reflect on the symmetry of it all. Here was a man who had built his empire on power, control, and the ability to manipulate every room he entered. Now, he was just another inmate in a system that thrived on taking those very things away. Diddy had spent decades cultivating an image of invincibility, yet the raw reality of his situation revealed the fragility beneath it all. His meticulous control, his connections, his influence. It was all meaningless in the face of iron bars and indifferent guards. Sitting with my notes late that night, I couldn't help but think about the survivors of his alleged crimes. In interviews, they had spoken of fear, shame, and lives irreparably altered. Many described how Diddy had used his wealth and connections as a shield, creating a sense of untouchable invulnerability. But now, that same man was reduced to begging for hospital observation, crying for a reprieve from the isolation and discomfort he once wielded so freely over others. One survivor, whom I had interviewed months earlier, said something that stuck with me. I just wanted him to know what it feels like to be powerless, to scream and have no one listen. They hadn't spoken with anger or malice, just a quiet yearning for something resembling justice. And here he was now, stripped of his entourage, his lawyers unable to unlock the gates of his cell. It wasn't revenge, not entirely, but it was a reckoning. The irony wasn't lost on the inmates either. Diddy, who once thrived on commanding attention, was now the subject of muttered jokes and sideways glances. "Big man thought he ran the world," one inmate had said during the yard's fleeting free hours, his voice dripping with mockery. Now he can't even run his own cell. Others were less vocal, their silence speaking volumes. Some even pitied him, as if the magnitude of his fall made him less a villain and more a cautionary tale. But it was more complicated than that. Power doesn't evaporate entirely. Even in his diminished state, Diddy remained a man who once had a hand in shaping industries, in controlling narratives. There were whispers about how his current predicament was affecting others, survivors, sure, but also those who had benefited from his empire. Associates were distancing themselves. Media outlets were cautious about how much to report, and his family had grown uncharacteristically quiet. The ripple effect of his actions, now magnified by his incarceration, was reaching far beyond the walls of the detention center. I watched him once, during one of the rare moments I'd been granted access to observe. He was sitting on the edge of his cot, head bowed, hands clasped tightly together. His lips moved faintly, though no sound reached me. Whether he was praying, meditating, or simply talking to himself, I couldn't tell. What struck me most wasn't the act itself, but the way he carried it out. Deliberate, controlled, as though even now he was trying to hold on to some sliver of his identity. The guards watched him too. I noticed how their demeanor had shifted over time. Some were openly suspicious, keeping their distance as if proximity alone could entangle them in whatever chaos still clung to him. Others were more resigned, treating him with the same bland indifference they afforded every inmate. But a few, just a few, seemed almost wary, as if they recognized that even caged, a man like Diddy could still be dangerous. And maybe he was. The incident with the sock had left more questions than answers, its implications reverberating through the prison like a low-grade hum. Had it been a plea for attention, a genuine act of despair, or was it something darker, a test of how far he could push the system? I couldn't shake the feeling that the truth was layered, its edges blurred by decades of manipulation and secrecy. The survivors I had spoken to would probably see it differently. To them, the sock incident wasn't just a moment of weakness, it was a reflection of something deeper. One described it as karma making its rounds, another called it a glimpse of his own medicine. They didn't relish his suffering, most of them didn't anyway. But there was a sense of closure, however fleeting, in knowing that he was no longer untouchable, and it had been the torture of Christ for them. Still, the question lingered. Was it enough? Could anything truly balance the scales for the lives he had allegedly damaged? Some would argue that his current plight was punishment enough, a man stripped of everything he valued and left to stew in his own regrets. Others, however, might see it as too little too late, a convenient downfall that allowed others to sweep their complicity under the rug. For me, the truth lay somewhere in the middle. Watching him shuffle through the yard, his shoulders hunched and his movements slow, it was hard to see the man who once dominated headlines and award shows. Yet I couldn't ignore the gravity of his past, the harm he had caused and the people he had hurt. His fall might have been inevitable, but it didn't erase what had come before. And yet there was something about the way he carried himself that made me wonder. Was he truly broken, or was this another performance, a carefully crafted act to elicit sympathy or leniency? The line between the man and the image had always been thin, and even now it was difficult to tell where one ended and the other began. The phrase, "what you do comes back to you," had been rattling around in my mind since the first time I set foot in the detention center. It was tempting to see Diddy's current state as proof of that sentiment, a neatly tied moral bow on a messy and painful story. But the reality was far more complex. Karma, if it existed, wasn't a straight line. It twisted and turned, intersecting with systems and people and choices in ways that defied simple explanations. As I gathered my notes and prepared to leave, I couldn't help but look back at the cell block one last time. The bars cast long shadows across the floor, a stark reminder of the man who once lived above it all but now existed in its depths. Whether justice had been served or was still waiting around the corner, I couldn't say. But one thing was certain, the echoes of his actions, both past and present, would linger far beyond these walls.